Thank you everyone for joining us. We're going to give one more minute for people to file in from the waiting room. Good morning. All right, who doesn't love a palindrome? It's 10:01, time to get rolling. Welcome everyone to the ATRC's webinar on Open Streets events. My name is Michael Hutnick. I am the ATRC coordinator. And if you haven't already, please take a moment to review the bullet points on this slide. As the last bullet indicates, this webinar is being recorded. So thank you for joining us. I can't wait to jump into today's topic, but first, a brief introduction of who we are. Now, if you're here, that most likely means that you are subscribed to our newsletter. So thank you very much for that. You probably have a pretty good idea of who the ATRC is. If you're not part of the newsletter, please join up. So the ATRC is a project of the Active Transportation Program within the Caltrans Division of Local Assistance. And our mission, or our general overview, perhaps, is a better term. So the Active Transportation Resource Center, or ATRC, its mission is to provide resources, technical assistance, and training to transportation partners across California to increase opportunities for the success of active transportation program projects. And we've got a few objectives to cover for today's webinar. So first, we would like you, and pay special note to these because we will follow up afterwards and ask how well we did on delivering on these objectives. So first of all, we want to learn about the opportunities of implementing an Open Streets program, to highlight challenges to implementing an Open Streets program, and to address context-specific considerations such as urban versus rural, established active transportation communities versus no existing active transportation culture, etc. So those considerations for implementing an Open Streets program. And in order to assist us in that effort today, we are joined by 4 wonderful practitioners. We'll be starting off by hearing from Mike Lydon, who is principal and co-founder of Street Plans based in New York. He is a writer, planner, speaker, and advocate for livable cities. Following Mike, we have Dr. Adonia Lugo, who is an author, California Transportation Commission commissioner, and an equity research manager at the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies, or ITS, who is a partner of the ATRC that we get to work with often through, unfortunately, not UCLA quite yet, but some of our other partners. Following Dr. Lugo, we have Jessica Tovar from Livable Cities. She is the program director for Sunday Streets SF, which is an open streets events in San Francisco. And then after Jessica, we'll be hearing from Peter, and you told me how to say your name a moment ago, but now I'm panicking. Dzewaltowski, Dzewaltowski, I think I got it. All right, who is a principal transportation planner with the city of Santa Monica, here to give us an implementers, the city level implementers point of view. He works in the mobility division, and his work is related to open streets and other community activating type of projects. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Mike Lydon.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Good morning to all of you in California. It is afternoon here in New York City. I'm always delighted to talk about this topic. It's something I'm very passionate about, and done a lot of work and advocacy over the years around expanding open streets into communities and disseminating best practices. There we go. Sorry, there's a little bit of delay on my slides today. So Street Plans is a consulting firm. We work a lot with community partners, from nonprofits to local cities, to regional governments. We've worked a lot across California, so I'm very familiar with the context that some of you all might be working in and advocating in. And we primarily look at projects where we can improve placemaking, transportation, and urban design initiatives in a variety of different types of communities. Open streets, what are they? We can start with a definition. That's when you temporarily close streets to motor vehicles so that people can use them for walking, cycling, skating, or basically any other physical or social activity. That being said, Open Streets programs traditionally have been very much aligned with the movements to improve physical activity in various communities. And the history here is quite fascinating in the United States and across North America. This goes back to advocacy within big cities across North America, including New York, San Francisco, Ottawa, Seattle, where advocates are trying to get vehicles out of parks. So large parks like Central Park or Golden Gate Park, and to get those to be car-free environments. A lot of that activism began in the 60s when environmental consciousness was growing and evolved over time. And so this movement to have car-free streets, even if just on weekends, as you saw in Seattle and in Ottawa, took root. But short of that, it was really Bogota in Colombia where a few years later, the same type of activism took root. But this work in Ciclovia started with in Bogota, which started with a program that was based on a demonstration of what Ciclovia could become in 1974, evolved into what is now, it's kind of the most famous program in the whole world. And if you don't know it, Bogota does this every single Sunday, and they've done that since 1981, when sort of the early advocacy in the 70s, made its way into a formal program that the city was advancing from that point forward with various fits and starts, but certainly now is known for its expansiveness and its frequency. Today, Ciclovia is at the 50-year mark from when that advocacy first started, those first initial bike rides, those car-free bike rides through the center of the city. I was fortunate enough to be down in Bogota for the celebration last December. At this point, they have 95 miles of interconnected streets that they close to vehicles every single Sunday. And with that frequency, they get a lot of repeat, users of the Ciclovia, and it's really embedded itself in the culture so that people get a real physical activity benefit from their participation with that level of frequency. And they've even transitioned this into what they call Ciclovia Nocturna. So they do a nighttime Ciclovia as well, which is really quite magical. So following the advancement of open streets and Ciclovias, primarily throughout South and Central America, a best practice manual sort of made its way to the States in 2008. And that was really almost in conjunction with a street film from Clarence Eckertson in 2008 that documented what was happening in Bogota. When I saw that, I was really floored by the movement and really excited about how that was at that time just starting to translate from that park-based roadway activism into programs that were launching in the United States that actually included a lot of supporting activities and were being done in a way that was much more like what you see in South America. I was fortunate enough to be part of a group that advocated and got one of these implemented in Miami around that same time that launched a pretty large movement for improving cycling and walking infrastructure in that city at the time. And as I was starting street plans in 2009, I pursued and was able to get a research grant from a foundation to develop what's called the Open Streets Guide, and then largely the Open Streets Project, which came thereafter. And that was really documenting how cities were rapidly adopting. You can kind of see in that center top graphic, that sort of hockey stick graph. That was really the adoption rate back then of major cities across the US, starting their own programs and then starting to document, as we did in the guide, best practices. And then we disseminated those best practices through a series of annual trainings that we did with a lot of various partners in different cities, including in Los Angeles back in 2014 as Ciclovia was getting off the ground there. So you can refer to that as a resource, but really the defining characteristics of open streets, again, traditionally has been about iconic streets, within large parks, route lengths of maybe 2, 3, up to 10 miles or more in length, with the purpose being to get those longer stretches of roadway so people could run and walk, bike longer distances for physical health. Most of the programs include activity hubs. So that can be anything from health service delivery to exercise classes to nonprofit tabling. In a lot of places across the US, this happens a few times a year, not quite as frequent as you see in South and Central American cities, but some programs you'll see have been able to achieve more of a monthly routine, which has been exciting to see, and we need to see more of that, I hope. And the purpose, again, is these healthy, active lifestyles. The challenge with that frequency is that the cost to deliver events of a scale this large in the US, which requires a lot of logistics, oftentimes a lot of police presence, gets very expensive very quickly. So that's been kind of the limiting factor, I think, on scale. But moving through the sort of mid 2010s into 2020, we all know what happened. And it was interesting to watch how the term and the idea of open streets became adapted to meet the needs of the pandemic. At Street Plans, we were really tracking and researching those adaptations in real time. And whether it was open streets or slow streets, some people call them healthy streets, you started to see neighborhood routes and other different types of contexts that were not originally part of the open streets movement start to evolve using very quick, low-cost resources that were on hand for various city departments and agencies. So open streets became part of a larger toolkit for responding to the demands of the pandemic, and has since taken root in a lot of places that has expanded sort of the definition, even while maybe shrinking some of the footprint. So open streets now, with this sort of bifurcated definition, can be about supporting local businesses and outdoor dining. It could be for just social gathering, creating plazas, or just closing a few blocks. That's oftentimes referred to as open streets. Of course, delivering health services, cultural programming, school streets oftentimes go by the term open streets these days as well. And then even full-on pedestrianization efforts have been categorized as open streets. And so the definition is fully expanded into more of those applications and uses, with the locations sort of evolving into more local commercial districts, schools, residential areas. The routes are much shorter in a lot of ways than those large signature open streets events that, again, many cities still have. Sometimes there's not even any programming. It's just literally the closure and letting people use the space in a low-key way, how they see fit. And in that way, you see a lot of the programs for open streets at this scale are seasonal or even operate 24/7. And the purpose is to again respond to all those different challenges and demands that we see, not just during the pandemic, but then thereafter, as we've restored things back to a more normal rhythm of life. And the cost of these types of interventions can be actually much lower than those large signature events. So now what we're seeing is that open streets become, at the smaller scale, a gateway to more permanent infrastructure that takes the essence of safety and all ages and abilities and accessibility in our streets, and trying to hardline those in a way that brings up that feeling and opportunity to more people in a permanent sense, not as an event, but as a way that infrastructure can evolve over time. So what is the future? Are we thinking about more of these large signature programs and events? Are we going to think about applying and diversifying the use of open streets continuously across the US? I think time will tell. This is still very much, I think, in an evolution state as these two definitions of open streets kind of run in parallel. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Lugo. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Hi, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon to you. I'm Adonia Lugo. And let's see, am I looking to get control of slides, or are we going to have... Oh, okay, there we go. Sorry, I was just waiting to find out what our protocol was for a second. So I'm Adonia. I use she, her pronouns. As was said earlier, I'm based at the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies, but also get to work with folks across the Fort Campus UC Institute of Transportation Studies network, including we have centers at Berkeley, Davis, where ATRC is located, of course, LA and Irvine as well. So just real quickly, I learned recently about this digital land acknowledgement model, and so it's something I'm trying out with presentations. I'm presenting from Tovangar, the unceded land of the Tongvakish Gabrielino peoples, using digital resources from UCLA that leave significant carbon footprints, contributing to changing climates that disproportionately affect Indigenous peoples worldwide. I acknowledge my responsibility and role in reconciliation and re-indigenizing this place. So yeah, trying to think beyond land acknowledgements, as I know a lot of us are. So what I'm going to be talking about today is being an anthropologist who studies sustainable transportation. And I'm waiting for my slide to advance here. I think there's just a slight delay. And what you're going to see popping up on the next slide is a few images about what it is to be an ethnographer. So ethnography is the primary method that anthropologists use to do research. So we learn about people and groups and how they relate to the world through participant observation by spending time with people, participating when we can ethically in what they're doing. And so I ended up doing, in 2008, started doing participant observation in the sustainable transportation movement. So mainly around active transportation, biking and walking. And so the images that you see here, one is an image from a community planning meeting around updating the city of Los Angeles's bike master plan, and somebody wrote on a map, all streets are bike streets. There's also an image of a man who is riding a pretty junky old mountain bike on a sidewalk in a very crowded part of LA called MacArthur Park. And then there's also an image of a ciclovia event in Los Angeles from a few years ago. And there's an image of my book, Bicycle Race, Transportation Culture and Resistance, where you can learn more about this stuff if you're interested. So as an anthropologist, my big question was, how come more people weren't biking, right? Climate change pressures, Southern California, a beautiful place. How come more people weren't biking? And I knew as a woman of color that there was a power struggle happening in our streets. And I really felt it once I became a bicycle user, that there was just this way that people who were driving cars were angry that I was there on a bicycle. Something about just me being on a bicycle made them angry. And so as I did research about the history of transportation systems in Los Angeles, I learned that absolutely racism and classism had played a big role in shaping the systems that I was engaging with around 2008. And so it definitely made sense to think about how those kind of past planning decisions related to the culture that I was experiencing in streets in the modern day. But in thinking about culture, which is what anthropologists are focused on, I noticed that the other people I was getting to know and collaborating with in the active transportation world were not talking about culture as something that we were trying to influence. We had this, grand plan for how we were going to get people out of cars, but it was really focused on changing physical infrastructure. And what I came to understand through being part of projects in LA like Ciclovia was that physical infrastructure alone does not explain how we move. You can have a street that's designed one way, and not everybody's going to use it the right way or in the same way. So if we can think about culture as a sort of human infrastructure that's also at play, that gives us another way to be understanding both how we shape street life through our own actual bodily movements, like literally the human infrastructure of the street, of the different bodies and vehicles that are out there, but also how we shape streets through social movements. So who is going to City Hall? Who is trying to influence the kind of decisions and spending that are happening for transportation? So those two tracks, looking at the bodily movements in the street and social movements as these forms of human infrastructure, are really what I've been engaged in for the last long period of time. And the social movement aspect is more my work on mobility justice. I won't really be getting into that today. But today, I want to talk about the imagined theory of change in the Ciclovia model that I helped to bring into LA. So as an anthropologist, I was looking at how we move through streets as an assemblage. That's the term that people in the theory spaces I was reading were using. That you have a particular kind of body, you have a particular kind of vehicle that body is engaging with. Maybe it's their own feet, maybe it's a wheelchair, maybe it's a car, maybe it's a bicycle. And then you have some kind of space that person and vehicle are traveling through. And we don't actually know how that trip's going to be, right? Because there's different bodies, there's different vehicles, there's a lot of factors. But if we can go to the next slide, we did know that predictably, the way that LA streets usually get filled up with cars doesn't feel that awesome to be out there on a bicycle. And so there were many people in LA who would look at traveling outside of a car and say, that's not for me. Or maybe they had a bad experience in the past and they say, that's not for me. And so even when we add new kinds of infrastructure that's supposed to support people using active transportation, using public transit, they don't necessarily have a good, positive embodied experience to be relating to. Like literally, we starved the cultures in our region that had positive associations with walking, biking, using transit, and put all of our positive associations on cars. And the other stuff, for most people has negative associations. So how could we build a culture? How could we disrupt that and give people a sense of a culture that felt more positive? So we can go to the next slide. And I appreciate the slide jockeying on the back end. Thank you. So what we were aiming for with our open street event in LA, Ciclavia, was, okay, well, if you change the landscape, at least temporarily, if you do this disruptive thing, then you're going to be going from having, a person traveling through streets that are largely dominated by automobiles and the tension, the power dynamic that is at play there, to a landscape where there's different dynamics at play. Certainly there are still power dynamics, but possibly people can be having a nicer time. And the last almost 15 years of events in LA have shown that lots of people do have a very nice time when they come out and use streets at Ciclavia, which is lovely. So a couple of things, I really appreciated Mike's narrative about how Ciclavia came to the US. Same thing for me. I saw the street film. I was like, whoa, could we do something like this? Went to Bogota. And something that was really important to me in 2008, as I was developing this anthropological project around active transportation, was actually bringing a model from Bogota as opposed to a place like Copenhagen. Felt like it made a lot more sense for Los Angeles, which is, also a very Latin American influenced city, a city that is slower on Sundays. It's a place that maybe people, could kind of, if we gave people the opportunity to have these positive cultural experiences with streets in Los Angeles, as opposed to the model of taking elected officials to lovely places on vacation where they can see bike infrastructure, stuff like that. If we could do this in situ, maybe we could give people more of a sense of how it could be possible. Let's go to the next slide. So it's fabulous. We love it. Woo! But how do we fund it? So I really think, having been a participant observer in this space for a long time now, these kinds of projects where we're actually trying to support people in developing new relationships with transportation, actually changing that human infrastructure, creating the culture for us to be multimodal, these are essential. We're not going to meet our state climate goals without them, because if we don't do that work, if we don't invest in changing the culture, our nice new infrastructure goes unused. So this is a photo on the slide of a lovely subway station near my home in Leimert Park, the K line, that has been plagued by very low ridership ever since Metro opened this up about almost 4 years ago now. So we need to support people in developing these relationships. But how do we get there when decision makers see open streets as a nice to have? This is something we're going through right now in Los Angeles in real time. Our mayor has proposed cutting different functions at the City Department of Transportation that would, really feels like walk us back in terms of progress that's been made for supporting, education and programming for active transportation. So next slide. Well, so here is a place where I'm seeing things really differently than I did back in 2010 when we had our first Ciclavia. I back then thought, one of the great things about this model is that it's relatively cheap. It's not expensive like changing the infrastructure. Today, now that I sit on the California Transportation Commission, where we approve a huge hundreds of millions, at the drop of a hat for infrastructure projects, I now think we need to be thinking much more ambitiously about how we want to invest in programming, in, open streets, in education, in clubs, in, community ambassadors, things like that. What if we could think about asking for much bigger labor costs? If we could actually be thinking about high road jobs as part of what we want to be building and adding to our material costs. Because when you have bigger ticket things, it attracts support from entities that are influential who don't see a lot of value in low cost projects that are not going to engage the workforces who are currently supported by how we do state transportation funding. So I'm really interested on the research side in starting to think through what can we learn from the highway builders? What can we learn from the building trades? And then bring into how we're thinking about large scale shifts toward supporting active transportation in the state. So that's kind of like where I'm going to leave things, just, knowing that we have this great model, but we really have to figure out how to convince people it's worth funding. Maybe an alternative path could be making what we're asking for look a little more like what is considered worthy of funding today. So thanks for listening. Looking forward to engaging with the audience, and I'm going to pass things over to Jessica.
Thank you, Dr. Lugo. Hi, everybody. My name is Jessica Tovar. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the program director for the program Sunday Street San Francisco. Today, I just kind of want to hit on how to foster community while producing events, as I think this will kind of be the foundation of event planning as you go forward to do your own. Before diving into how to build community, I just want to first share a little bit of context about the program I work for and what we do. Sunday Streets SF is San Francisco's open streets program. Our mission is to transform streets into car-free spaces with free resources, health-focused activities, opportunities for play, movement, and connection. We recently launched our 2025 season, during which we'll host 7 events across 7 different neighborhoods throughout San Francisco. And in this presentation, I'll be referencing some of my own experiences from working on these events. You'll also hear me use the term community broadly and in the plural form communities. And I just kind of want to explain why I'm doing this. San Francisco is made up of many distinct neighborhoods. Every neighborhood is very different with its own character, history, and challenges. And when I say communities, I'm acknowledging this diversity, right? So it's not just geography, but the race, culture, economic background, and many of the subgroups that make up the fabric, social fabric of each neighborhood, right? So with that in mind, I also want to talk about why community building is important. So when we build community, we foster connection. This is something that I think is really important, especially as we start hearing about the loneliness epidemic, widespread social isolation, right? This connection can take a lot of different forms. So it could be someone attending the event, getting to know their neighbor for the first time. It could be maybe a resident of the neighborhood meeting a local organization they didn't know before. In these moments, they'll build trust, they'll build a sense of belonging, and also a shared sense of identity. And community building will also strengthen support systems. So these will be networks that will provide emotional, informational, and practical support. So these networks will become your long-term allies. If you want your event to continue year after year, these are the people who are going to show up, they're going to advocate for you, and they're going to help you carry the work forward. Community building also empowers collective impact. So it helps individuals unite around a common goal, right, to drive meaningful change. So if your event has a specific mission or a purpose, the community is going to be the people that are there to support it, right? There's real power in numbers. And importantly, community building promotes equity and inclusion. A connected community leads to better mental health, physical health, and overall well-being. This is also tying back to what I mentioned earlier. You're recognizing that neighborhoods are not one-dimensional. They're made up of different cultures, histories, economic backgrounds, and experiences. So effective community work is going to take all of that into account. Many of you are here today because you're passionate about producing your own events. So I want to kind of talk about, so how do we build that community, right? And here are some strategies. The first one that I would recommend before you have an event somewhere, it's really important that that the community you're going to is welcoming of it, right? So you can distribute a community survey. This would be sharing information about your organization and its mission, outlining your goals, what it is that you're looking to accomplish. Ideally, this would also include information about your event, your proposed footprint, the date or dates that you're looking to have the event, as well as the event timing. And of course, you'll be providing space for feedback. And you can share this survey a bunch of different ways. So you could do that digitally, through email, newsletter, on your website, through your social media channels. You could work with community organizations to also share out this survey through their networks. And you can even go beyond just emails and social media. You could do door-to-door outreach, letting the folks get to know you, you also getting to know people firsthand, and also hearing that feedback right then and there. Ultimately, the goal here is to make sure the community welcomes the event. It shows the neighborhood their voice matters, because it truly does. And real community building means listening first. Another way that you can go about building community would be hosting community meetings. These meetings are gold. They're going to help you understand what the community has and potentially what they're needing. They'll let ideas bloom and connections be strengthened in these meetings. So you'll learn about great organizations local to the community, what services they provide. And these are the folks that you want to be a part of your event. And by having these meetings, you'll get to plan with the folks that are based in the neighborhood. You can connect with them. You can listen to their ideas, see if you can implement them, or connect them to someone who can. So let's say if they have an idea, but maybe they don't have the capacity to actually host this idea, maybe somebody else in the meeting can. So these meetings will help shape the programming of your event and help the event just overall be smoother the day that it comes. Folks get to ask questions in real time. You get to get your information across in real time. And then, of course, you get to put a face to all the people who are going to be working at the event. These meetings should be open to residents, organizations, local businesses. And the key tip here is to listen carefully, take notes, support ideas when possible, and connect people to resources when needed. I'd also kind of like to emphasize engaging merchants and small businesses, especially if they are located on your event footprint. You definitely want to let these people know about the event beforehand and get them excited, right? The idea here is that your event can boost business and not burden it. So there's some key ways that you can kind of go about that conversation that can be encouraging the business to stay open. Maybe your event is on a day it would normally be closed, seeing if they can open on that day. If they're opening at a later time, it would see if they're able to align their business time with your event time, right? They could also offer maybe a special discount for the day for event attendees in collaboration with your event. You can encourage them to activate their storefront. So for example, if it's like a restaurant, they can put tables and chairs out front. Folks can take their food, eat it there. If it's kind of like a retailer, like the picture here, they can put out racks or displays out front. You would also be featuring them in event guides, social media, highlighting them. Maybe you do an Instagram reel or a TikTok to kind of showcase them, right? And then another key point here is community organizations. These folks are your best allies. They are the people that bring programming and activations. They help spread the word. They strengthen credibility and relationships. Definitely take the time to build the relationships out with community organizations. So taking additional meetings, get a coffee with folks, send follow-up emails. It can be time consuming, but your commitment is going to strengthen your relationship and will grant long-term partnership. In the pictures here in the slide that I have, this is one of our community partners. This is the St. Anthony's Foundation of San Francisco. They're a wonderful partner. They bring many activations to Sunday streets. Here I'm just kind of showing a few. So for example, they have face painting here. They also have a plant potting station. They also brought out a dunk tank, which is really cool. They had their own executive director, Father John Hardin, who got dunked that day. And then, of course, with community building, we'll talk about the hard part as well, which is event planning means navigating rules and regulations, right? So community building will also extend outside of just the community. It'll extend into your relationship with the city and the departments that are going to approve your event and ensure they're up to code. So you'll walk this really fine line, making sure you're not kind of falling into either side, right? If you fall into the side of the city, you might find yourself saying no to activations and causing tension with the community. And in all honesty, it might just be that the community are not really informed about these rules and guidelines, right? And vice versa, if you have activities in your event that are not up to code, that are not safe, you'll cause tension with the city. And if you're looking to have continuous events and annual events, you'll need to be in good standing with the city. These are the folks that'll be approving you. And if your event is not up to code, they can very easily tell you, no, it's not going to happen anymore. And this is where transparency kind of becomes your best tool. So when you're talking to the community, I would really encourage to not outright shutting down ideas and instead redirecting them with context. I think this is an improv kind of thing, but it's the yes and, right? So for example, if you have a partner, they want to bring out this certain activity, you don't want to outright just say no. You want to say, yeah, that sounds like a great idea, and here's how we can do that safely and legally. So you're helping them understand the process while also keeping your event in good standing with the city. By doing that, you're building trust on both sides. And when we talk about transparency, we also talk about honesty. So while we're on this topic of a partner wanting to bring out a certain activation, not only should you be honest about permits and regulations, but also what your organization can contribute. Now, this should be a conversation that you're having with your organization beforehand. Do you have money for programming? Do you have funding? And if so, how much is it? And this should be talking points that you have pre-programmed for when you do go out and have these conversations with partners. This will be especially brought up in the community planning meetings. So now that you have your funding and you know what you can and cannot contribute, you should be honest about it. Offer what you can support and clearly state your limitations. So for example, you might find yourself having the conversation of, yes, we can cover the cost for this, we can book it and bring it out. We don't necessarily have the capacity to actually host this on event day. Can you commit to hosting this, and then we can commit to covering the cost for it? And the key reminder here is to don't make promises that you can't keep. This will be detrimental to how you are perceived and your organization is perceived. No one likes working with folks who make promises and never come through. See what you can do, even if it's small, right? And then above all, the community will appreciate honesty. They just want to feel like respected, and being honest is being inclusive, right? And then another key point that I want to talk on here, Mike hit on this earlier when he kind of showed the evolution of open streets throughout the years. So be flexible. Adaptability is key to community building. As you go on to produce your own events, remember that things are ever changing. And with that, it's important to adapt and be flexible. It's entirely possible that your event may change one way or the other. So that can be the footprint, the timing, the programming, and that's totally okay. By adapting, that just shows that you're listening and you're applying the feedback that you've heard. From my own experience with Sunday Streets, when we were first implemented, it operated strictly as a cyclovia, like we were talking about earlier. After re-emerging from the pandemic, the feedback we ended up receiving was that some of the neighborhoods thought a block party that was jam-packed with resources for the community would be much more beneficial, would have a bigger impact. So with that, now our season operates as a hybrid. So we do still have open streets events or cyclovias, and we do also have neighborhood block parties. And this is all just to say that the events can change while also still staying true to your mission. So even though the formatting of our event has changed, it's still true to our mission. It's just in a format that better fits that specific neighborhood. And then in conclusion, community building, it's not easy. It takes effort, a whole lot of humility, and a whole lot of follow-up. But when you center the community, when you listen, when you adapt, and you collaborate, you don't just host an event. You create something by the community, for the community. At Sunday Streets, we live by that, and I encourage you to do the same. Thank you, guys. I'm going to pass it on to Peter now.
Hi, good morning. My name is Peter Dzewaltowski, and I am a urban planning practitioner with the City of Santa Monica. And I'm here to talk to you primarily about our active aging pilot program. And so you might ask yourself, what does that have to do with open streets? And that's a great question. And I think that Jessica did a great job in kind of setting the stage for my particular presentation, because I think it highlights different ways that you can go about achieving open street goals, while at the same time, avoiding the need to open the streets or close them and the cost that it's associated with that. Also, in my duties in the City of Santa Monica, I would point out that, I am in fact the other person. I am the one that sits on the other side of the table when you would want to permit a project like a block party or an open street event. My team administers those programs. We do the permitting for those. So you may have some questions about how that works and some of the complexities that are involved in that. And I'd be happy to do my best to answer those. So our particular program, we were funded by Caltrans with an active transportation grant. The total cost of our active aging program was $500,000. And what we did was after the completion of our pedestrian action plan, we basically had a lot of input from our community about the needs for seniors. So we came up with the concept of doing an active aging pilot program intended to test a range of different mobility activities and explore what types of approaches were effective in supporting older adults, helping them stay active, independent, and socially connected, helping them identify or helping us identify models that can be refined and replicated for ourselves, but also for other communities. And so this kind of gets to the heart of what Jessica was explaining towards the end of her presentation, that our project didn't necessarily involve an open street event directly, but it shares many of the same goals: improving mobility, accessibility, and community connection. So you can kind of see here, these were the goals that we had started with our active aging project when we, actually, matter of fact, it was kind of between the completion of our pedestrian action plan and our pilot program, we had developed these goals that we wanted to accomplish. And really, in many ways, these are shared directly with the goals of open street events. And the difference is really the format. Open street events, the pilot was embedded in daily life, rather than a specific event that would occur, that you would need to go through the process and expense of administering. So a lot of them were a lot less expensive than administering an open street event, even though the overall program, was a fairly significant cost. But both programs, reclaim public space for people, and they prioritize accessibility, safety, and physical activity. We actually started our project during just before the pandemic. Then the pandemic struck, and so we were a little bit thwarted by that particular effort. But this kind of gives an idea of the timeline and steps that we went through in the process. And there's a couple of points that I'd like to make, when kind of thinking about the project and its design. One of the efforts was really in order to create something that would be replicable by other communities. And so at some of these different stages, we, during the program development and then after the implementation, we did a couple of different things. We developed a program guide that's available to different communities if you're interested, that looks at the different activities that we administered. We did 34 different types of events that ranged from educational classes and activities to technology training, and then all the way to different types of outings where we experienced different types of modes of transportation, different travel options, and some different kind of exposition type of events as well. So there was a pretty big range in what we did. And so we then, at the end of the process, we evaluated those particular programs and we figured out what was the most successful and what would be the best thing to replicate. And those are some things that we're happy to share with anybody that might be interested from today's presentation. I have contact information at the end if you can reach out, and we'd be happy to give that to you. But we had a pretty wide range of participants and a lot of different events. And I'll highlight some of the ones here that are the most kind of related. One of the things we did was social and experimental types of events. So we did group walks to different types of resources within the community. We would walk to maybe a coffee shop and then have a, we'd have somebody from the city come that they can come and talk to, and we would use that as an opportunity to help people become better advocates for themselves. We also did transit outings where we would pick certain destinations within the community and we would then take them on a transit trip. We partnered with the Metro on the Move program in order to administer those. You can see we have a picture here of the group after we made a trip to the Getty Museum. So these types of outings, I think, align really well with the spirit of open street events by promoting active transportation and social connections, and at the same time providing them accessibility to different mobility options. A lot of the seniors are very wary and cautious about using the train, not only because of the pandemic. I mean, that was kind of an underlying thing that was going on at the same time, but also because of the of just the train together being something strange. We also did group bike rides. We experimented with them getting on bicycles, riding bikes, and doing different activities in order to be able to make them more comfortable with alternative modes. So this was a great thing to be inclusive of a number of different groups. We also did outings where we kind of linked different things together, like different walking to a bus stop, taking a bus, and then making a connection with a train in order to help users become more familiar with how to use the transit system and integrating some of the different options that they have, and then building their comfort levels as they begin to experiment with those different types of mobility options. Also, we did a transportation and senior kind of focused mobility expo, where we had a number of different vendors that would come and provide different resources to the older adult community. We had someone that did a walking resource center, where they went over the mechanics of walking and how to, improve your walking techniques and how to be safe walking. So that was a pretty helpful. This was one of the things that kind of rose to the surface as people liked. And so the kind of key results, just to give you an idea, I mean, we had very strong results in people that would begin to use more transportation options at the end of the pilot program. It really facilitated them becoming more comfortable. They were better able to access their daily needs. So that was another thing that was very encouraging, and that most of the attendees, 83% of the program, helped them connect with people. So that was one of the most significant kind of positive elements. So you can see, when we look on this bar chart, active outings, walking outings, community events, things with social elements really rose to the surface as being the most valuable to the community. And so when we think about this and how it would relate to something like a open streets event, there's a number of different things that you can do for a lot less money, if you desire to do that without going through the efforts to close the street. And if you are closing the street, then you do have options in order to add some of these different elements to an open streets event. So, you might choose to have guided walks as part of a street closure. You might provide certain amenities or comforts to the senior community, like rest stations or watering stations, or navigational support on where you can go to certain things, where you might be able to reach an accessible bathroom, for example, to kind of ease and make it more comfortable for them to participate. The other thing is, in particular with the bicycle rides, intergenerational activities like games, dance, storytelling, or music is also a great way to bring together different people from the community and to include them in the event. And then also, just like the mobility expo that we had done, there's a lot of different things that you can do by bringing in different resources to help inform them about bus passes and different benefits that are available to a group like a senior community that might be really helpful for them to explore those different resources. So that's kind of a quick overview of what we did, and please take down my email, and if you're interested, I'd be happy to share any of that information with you, and I can pass it back to Michael Hutnick.
Thank you very much. Terrific, amazing, wonderful stuff. Thank you all so much. I also want to recognize the team behind the scenes. We've got Michelle Lieberman running the tech by and large in the background. We've got Allie monitoring the chat and answering questions in the Q&A, and we've got Emma running some of the other technical aspects of this. All great team members, wonderful to work with, love it. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A, and I encourage everyone to add some more questions there, because if you don't, I've got a list of questions that we're going to go down after we address these couple here. So Annabelle in the Q&A asks, what kind of community meeting types are recommended? And then how do you structure the conversation? So these questions, they might pertain specifically to one person's presentation, but since you all have experience, feel free to weigh in if you've got something to say.
I can start. Yeah, it's pretty common for some of these open streets visions to be born at City Hall and therefore to be at a very large, big scale, which means that if you're thinking about engagement after you've kind of decided that this initiative is going to happen, that can be quite challenging in a way to be able to do authentic engagement over very long distances. So I think you have to think about scale and how you would communicate and work with different groups on the ground, right down to, as Jessica said, like working with individual retailers, right? So I think a lot of it can be through online forums, just it's easier for people to participate, also sending out surveys, and I think being really thoughtful about where along the routes you've selected, whether it's 10 blocks or it's 10 miles, would be advantageous to have actual ambassadors or staff, people on the ground interacting at bus stops and on the street to like just get people's input and awareness starting to go about why we're doing this, how long is it going to last, how is it going to impact me. I think a lot of those questions are generally based around the timing of open streets and what do I do if I need to drive home, or what do I do if I have a delivery coming from my business. And so there's a lot of logistical things to kind of be able to address, and you need to think that through no matter what the communication format is.
Yeah, and just to interject here, something that you had said about, go to bus stops, go to these, neighborhood association meetings, go to the, meeting people where they're at is something that I've heard coming out of sort of like a new wave of public engagement, that instead of just the city council meetings or things that very few people might attend relative to the population that you're trying to serve, go to where they are. Very, very good advice. Do we have anyone else that would like to weigh in on this question? Going once, going twice. All right, great advice. Thank you so much. So we also have a question in here from Deb that says, how do we win over city leaders to scale an event from, say, a half mile to more 1 mile, 3 miles? I think one of the examples in the slides was a 10-mile event. Beautiful. I would love to have that. So advice on that front.
Well, I think there's people that would be better prepared to talk about the advocacy component, but I would stress that from a city's perspective, start the process early if you want to be able to convince the city to do something that might be different. Leaving more time leaves more opportunity for you to work through some of the challenges that might be associated with extending an event like that, like for example, bus rerouting and traffic control, things of that nature. That's all I have for that.
Yeah, the scale of the event is where the cost is born from, right? So I think what's important, well, I don't know if you're asking this question from, hey, we already have a program and we're looking to expand it, or we're contemplating one of a certain size, but we're interested in expanding it in the future. But I think in short, getting some version of it down, even at a shorter distance, is important because it helps you work out the kinks and get a proof of concept. And that oftentimes it's very important for, bus operators, emergency responders, PD traffic control to like understand the requirements. And sometimes we see from there, you can find efficiencies. Well, maybe you don't need as many police staff as you originally thought, right? You can actually hand over the minor intersection control to volunteers, and that starts to reduce the cost, but then expand the footprint of what's possible. Another technique is that a lot of cities will, looking for pure mileage, they will use those streets in parks, right, or along waterfronts that are relatively easier to close and or already closed on weekends or closed permanently, and have that be part of the route. So for example, just thinking out loud, San Francisco, the main road through Golden Gate Park, JFK Boulevard, has been closed permanently to vehicles. If you had then that mileage attached to another few miles out from the park, then you get the benefit or the co-benefit of doing, yes, the neighborhood street or the commercial street, but also linking it with the park space. And so that can kind of expand the footprint of the route as well.
And I did want to just chime in and say, absolutely having something that to start with to give people a visualization of what it is you're talking about is really key. In Los Angeles, it took us 2 years of organizing to get the pieces in place to have our first event in 2010. And prior to the event, it was, city staff who we were coordinating with were like, so it's a race? Like, is the start and this is the finish? And we're like, no, it's a linear park, you know? And it was just much easier for everybody to be on the same page about what we were talking about once they'd seen the event and experienced it. But I also wanted to uplift something that I remember the panelists discussing in our planning call that I don't think we mentioned directly, but you know, this labor cost of police time is a major issue with this model. And for those of us who have serious questions about the effectiveness of policing as a street safety solution, and have concerns about the resistance to there being accountability measures in place to see whether it's an effective investment. You know, it really feels like not a good way to spend a bunch of money. If the most expensive thing about this event is labor costs, that's not bad. But if it's labor costs for an element that we don't necessarily feel we're getting any value out of, that seems like a problem. So what is it that we would need to have in place? And, you know, in the California context, what is it that we would need to have in place to actually allow these kinds of events to operate without that constriction? That's a question that I think is, you know, important for us to figure out. And I would love to follow up with ATRC to talk about that more. Is it, you know, legislation? Is it just having, you know, some kind of model that's explicit in funding program guidelines? What is it that we need to have? Because we know that this cost is not making the event safer, right? Like that's ostensibly what it's for. There's probably other things that could be invested in to expand the safety effects. So anyway, just wanted to bring that up as an area where I think we could do some more work.
Excellent. And I'm going to jump in here to tie in, I believe it's Jean's question is the next one that dovetails with what we've been talking about. It says, on average, how much do you budget to put on an open streets event? And this question made me think about the way that agencies who are applying generally, at least from the applications that I get, seem to generally view how they should scale it. And it's like, and it seems like there's a bit of timidity. Like people are kind of timid about going big. And when I was listening to Peter's presentation and seeing that there were 34 different types of events under that program, I thought that was amazing. I would love to see bigger and more imaginative types of non-infrastructure programming funded through the ATP. So, which is why the ATRC is hosting this, right? Because the non-infrastructure project types or programming is this is where you can get your funding. I saw there was a question down here from Marvin about how do you fund these, and we can I'd like to pass this off to some of the other implementers here to see outside of the ATP what are some of the other options. But the CTC loves to see large transformative infrastructure projects, and those are terrific. And I'm curious, like the CTC, the commissioners, like what's the mood? Like if you can speak on this, Dr. Lugo, what's the mood about non-infrastructure projects, like scaling those up for those also to be transformative, because we've got this real need for a culture shift so that we have when the infrastructure does come in, that we have the support from the community because they've been activated and brought into this space instead of just seeing it as, you know, taking space away from cars or some sort of a, you slowed me down, it's a hindrance sort of a thing, but it is something that's welcome. So what's the CTC's general view of scaling up these, the funding for these larger, more ambitious programs, if you're able to speak on that? Thank you.
Well, I mean, I think the short answer is plan. What plan? That's the short answer. But the longer answer is we all know that the Active Transportation Program, which is a CTC funding program that covers projects like this and infrastructure projects, is oversubscribed, right? That's the term everybody uses. There's way more applications than can actually be funded. It's always on the chopping block in the governor's budget. And so I'm going to put a link in the chat box. This is a resource that I think ATRC might be involved in maintaining. That's CTC funding programs or other sources of funding that could be used for active transportation programs. So that's one thing. That's the answer I've heard is, oh, well, look to these other programs to see, you know, what can be funded. But again, that question of non-infrastructure versus infrastructure, that's in one part why I think if we can formalize the use of a term like human infrastructure or social infrastructure and start to really name the function of these kinds of programs as something that does tie in with uses of the physical infrastructure system, that might help explain their value better. But again, also, you know, a process I'm in the midst of trying to figure out is how do you get the transportation industry, which at this point in time is largely organized both in terms of labor and in terms of companies talking to each other around highway construction and, you know, brick and mortar projects. How would you get them on board with supporting the expansion of projects like this? And so there are some members of the CTC who are based in labor, like Jay Bradshaw and Joe Cruz. So those are commissioners to, you know, ask questions like that. And then, you know, talking to lobbying organizations, Transportation California, which is the voice of the transportation industry. You know, what can we get on the same page with them around what could be funded? The current approach, unfortunately, for active transportation funding at the advocacy level has had to be very reactive, and it's focused more on saying we shouldn't build highways. But the thing is, that sort of a strategy is not appealing to these spaces where they are supposed to be saying yes to big projects. So if our strategy is don't say yes to big projects, we're kind of running into, you know, a dead end. So what I'm putting out there in terms of let's think big, let's ask for a big thing, it's kind of an untried strategy. I think we can learn from some existing very expensive projects like high-speed rail, although I have the impression that most people don't look at that as an example of success, but it's certainly spent a lot of money and is for something other than highways. But this is research to be developed. Like I personally am working on developing a research proposal to see what we can learn from how labor has been organized in the building trades and in transit to see if there's a model we can, you know, kind of bring into active transportation. My understanding is, you know, the way that labor works in those spaces is you have an industry and then you have organized workers who work within those industries. And so they're, you know, able to come to the table together. In active transportation, we don't have that, you know, so much of the work that, you know, I see happening is through consulting firms. I don't think the workers at those firms typically are organized. And then there's this big, you know, problematic space of subcontracting where you have small community-based organizations who are more plugged into communities who may join projects through prime consulting firms. But, you know, labor-wise, we're talking about in the realm of volunteers, $50 gift cards. So that's what I mean about scaling up. If we were to imagine having more programming like this, where everybody who was working on it was compensated at like a very good level, and it wasn't, you know, just contracting and, you know, young people who are excited, who work for free. Hello, that's how I worked in this space for as long as I have. There's, I think, we would get to a different place in terms of what we're asking for. And it's been our instinct for so long in active transportation to say, oh, it's so low cost. This makes so much sense. And I totally agree with that. I actually personally think that, you know, streets are flexible, man. If we just take over and use them differently, we don't need to change the infrastructure at all. Like that's my hippie, belief. However, in terms of how all this public money we have is going to be spent, I think that we actually, ironically, have to ask for a bigger chunk of it systematically in order to get even the little bits that we're trying to get. So again, this is like me thinking as an academic, like how could we work within the system that's there? And what I know from the Transportation Commission side is if the building trades get a bunch of people in helmets and vests into the room, a project is going to go forward.
A couple like really different ideas that ways that communities have done this very creatively at a very low cost, at least to start an initiative. One would be, you might have an existing road race that's organized every year in your city. Could be a fun run, could be a 10K, could be a half marathon, a marathon. That usually has a mobilization that's been worked out over time around the closure costs, and the funding is sort of born through the participants of that road race. There's always an opportunity to extend the hours of that. And I've seen communities do that where there might be a road race in the morning that may, end by, say, last runner comes in around 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning. And then you just would keep that closure going for another 4 or 6 hours into the afternoon is one way to think about delivering the open streets experience where, yes, you probably have some costs, but it's going to be greatly reduced. Another is, if you've got champions inside of City Hall, like a police chief, and we had this in Miami where he was a runner and he understood the value of on a Sunday morning being able to go out into the street and use it, with being safe. He basically said to all of his officers who were required to work the event that instead of working, on Sunday as overtime, you're going to take Tuesday off instead. And Tuesday's a new Sunday, and you're going to work on Sunday instead. So there wasn't any overtime cost that was incurred, and that brought the cost down from hundreds of thousands of dollars to, thousands of dollars in terms of police labor. So there's that. There's, the program in Southern California that's sponsored by SCAG. It's called Go Human. I'm not sure if they're still doing this, but that's been, over many years with many different types of projects that have been funded, like Open Streets. They've been using CMAQ dollars to sort of program that and make sure there's resources for communities. And so you might look regionally, right, to your regional planning bodies who have resources and money and say, we may not be building out a full program that's going to happen 4 times this year or 10 times this year, but we're going to do a pilot of it through the funding that's available through programs like that to get that proof of concept off the ground. And again, that would come at a reduced cost to the local municipality having to bear all of that upfront.
Love that. Yeah, so that SCAG program, they have what's called a kit of parts that they utilize for the demonstration projects. You could build little parklets and things like that. So if we have any regional partners on the call, that's a great investment to make to be able to support these types of efforts. I did want to focus in a little bit on the question of cost. So Annabelle specifically asked, Jessica, do you have any estimates / unit costs that you could share for one of these events? If you could just briefly speak on it as well, about like ballparking, what are one of these Sunday Street SF events cost?
Yeah, absolutely. A block party can easily range up to 30,000. If you're looking to do an open streets event, just depending on how big your street closure is going to be and how much of an impact it'll have on the city, that could easily be double. I talked about being transparent and being honest in the presentation. The Sunday Streets series, it can range from $500,000 to easily $1 million to produce a whole season of events, right? So it is very expensive, not to not encourage you all to put these on, but that's just being open and honest as someone that does put on these events. We're talking about funding, and we talked about, where funding can come from. In my particular case, the funding does come from the San Francisco Department of Public Health. They only fund a portion of the overall cost. So we actually heavily rely on donors, volunteers, and, maybe we have like a registration fee for folks who sign up for the event. So we have to make up for that other $500,000 that goes into the event production of itself. So even with grants, it might not be entirely covered. So that's also something to keep in mind. Also something to think about when you are determining how many events to have, how long you want to have it. We threw around this idea of a 10-mile long event. That's incredibly expensive to think about, right? Even in my case, we are in partnership with SFMTA. Those are the folks who are going to be approving our event, right? So they'll waive our special event permit application, which is not this huge waiver, right? There's still so many things that go into the event. There's barricades, the street closure equipment. There's the staff that you're going to be hiring to be on site of the event, making sure it's safe and up to code, right? There's that programming that all of us have also talked about. If you have money for programming, and in all honesty, just the production of the event will mostly eat up the majority of your budget. That's typically why programming is a little bit hard when you're doing events. That's kind of why we emphasize really leaning in on the community as well. When you are producing an event, you're covering all these costs. The way to market it is to let people know that this is an open space for you to take advantage of, right? So if you have partners who maybe don't have the funding to put on an event by themselves, the idea is they partner with you, take up this space, take advantage of this space, and that way your partners can allocate their funding to the actual programming versus putting on the event. We talked about talking to city officials, which is definitely something that I highly encourage. I just did it earlier this year. I had meetings with all the district supervisors that we have events in. A good idea is to take your idea and really make the city official think it's theirs. Let them put their name on it. Let them try to market it as their own. If they just got elected into office, this is kind of like their thing, right? To help them gain their popularity, and they love it. Invite them to also be a part of the event. Have a speaker series, have these elected officials show up and speak at your event. They love that. They like the publicity. This will also kind of help you to see if they can kind of get involved. You want to have them kind of take ownership in a way that'll also kind of help them fund for it. Ideally, if they really like it, they're going to put the money towards this program, which will definitely help you in the long run. If not, maybe they're able to offer you some kind of in-kind partnership. If they're not able to actually fund the program itself, maybe they're able to fund some kind of programming, right? So maybe you have like a rest zone that the supervisor wants to fund. Maybe the mayor wants to bring out, XYZ, and they'll fund and maybe give money to fund those kind of aspects of it. So yeah, I just want to talk about when we talk about costs and things like that, this is a very real conversation. I appreciate everybody here bringing that up.
That is such a great point. I think you need to add that into your slide deck about like how to communicate with elected officials, make it seem, like it's their idea. And then because that feeds into that sustainability aspect of programming like this. So that touches on the scale of the funding that you're asking for. You need to build that human infrastructure and that organizational infrastructure to be able to sustain something like this long term, to be able to chase that funding, to be able to maintain those relationships that can keep these efforts from going, so that you don't have to start from zero every time you want to do something. So excellent stuff. I want to make sure that we get to as many questions as possible from the chat. We got 12 minutes left and I've got a bunch of stuff I'd like to ask, but Patrick joins us and asks, are there best practices for using open streets events to also test out and drive community engagement for pop-up and temporary infrastructure projects along or adjacent to the same corridor?
Yes, absolutely. It's it's important, I think, to think of the dynamics of the open street when you're trying to preview infrastructure that might be considered or in design. When you test that along the actual route, it's a condition that's not like what that infrastructure might be like when it gets built. So oftentimes the way we've thought about doing demonstration projects in conjunction with open streets is looking to improve infrastructure with protected bike lanes or wider sidewalks or curb extensions, those sorts of features on streets that intersect with the route. Or we try to close gaps in the route from, say, there's a park that's, say, 6 blocks away, maybe there's a proposal along that corridor that would intersect with the actual route, do the demonstration there. So it's kind of looking at, what's under consideration or what's, stuck politically, how do we show people what this could look like? And while there is some value in doing that on the actual route, it's not going to give you that same, I think, impact as doing it on a street that is still, shared with motor vehicles, that gets people to and from the actual open streets route safely. And that gives you a little bit more of an ability to do some qualitative, evaluation about that change in infrastructure on the ground.
We have a specific example in Santa Monica. We had a CBDG funded project for the Michigan Avenue Neighborhood Greenway. And we did the testing of a series of different traffic calming features that were installed by our city field crews, like chicanes, traffic circles, pedestrian curb extensions. We did it in the corridor. They were left out there for a period of time. We did a survey to see how people responded to those, as well as other data gathering. And then we had a celebrational event where people could get up close and look at those and ask questions, and had a food truck that came and had like live music and some other features to engage people over the topics.
Awesome. Peter, I was reminded of something that you brought up during your presentation about, or perhaps it was Jessica as well, about flexibility, about you might have sort of a vision for what your event's going to look like. And during that engagement process, you need to have that flexibility to be able to modify it to serve the needs that are being voiced to you. And I want to bring our attendees' attention to the, I'm blanking all of a sudden on the guidance, the non-infrastructure guidance for the ATP. And that will tell you what you need to do when you're creating your work plan, your 25R. And I just want to sort of encourage people to, when you're applying for cycle 8, which you should be excited about, even though the amount of funding out there might not be as much as previous years, there's going to be funding and you've got a chance to get it. And we're happy to help you get it, because we are doing a disadvantaged community technical assistance that should be coming online pretty soon. So please go to the ATRC website if you would like some technical assistance and your project serves a disadvantaged community. We will be making our selection after the applications close at the end of May. So please, we're happy to help you put your application together, whether it's for an infrastructure or non-infrastructure project. But when you're looking at putting together non-infrastructure programming, or human capital program, or human infrastructure, I think is Dr. Lugo's term, something like that. When you're putting these things together, leave yourself a little bit of space to have that adaptability to it. Because even if you put something down on your application and things kind of change, you can request from us here at the ATP at Caltrans to do a scope modification. So it's not a full-on scope change, as long as all of your benefits that you said that would come from this programming in your application, as long as you're maintaining those benefits, how you're doing that can change, and we can approve that pretty easily. So yeah, wanted to encourage that. And let's see. I had another question that hopefully everybody can weigh in on. I wanted to ask, for those of you who have implemented programming, open streets programming, what didn't work, and why didn't it work, and what did you do to adapt to that? The last 5 minutes or so.
I mean, we had envisioned that by putting on these events, we were going to radically transform the culture of LA's streets within a matter of months. So I would say something I haven't seen figured out yet, and again, I'm not speaking on behalf of the Ciclavia organization. I'm just a big fan, but I'm not currently part of the organization. But I have not seen figured out in LA, how do we channel the good vibes into more support at the policy level? So be able to demonstrate the public value of these kinds of investments. Something hasn't quite connected the dots yet. I mean, the organization has done a fantastic job of, getting up to 10 events a year, which is awesome. But just the way that our process continues to kind of frame this stuff as nice to have as opposed to essential shows that we haven't figured out how we plug back in the support to really shift the thinking in terms of how this fits into our transportation system. So I think that's still to be determined.
Yeah, that activation aspect of it, making that connection, because somebody asked earlier in the questions, and I kind of skipped that part of their question. There's like, what if California runs out of money? What are we going to do? And just to remind everyone, if it was its own country, California would be the 4th or 5th largest economy. We're not going to run out of money, but it's all about prioritization, how we budget things, and the people who write the laws and decide where the money goes are reacting to the feedback that they get. And a lot of the feedback they get, drivers are very good at providing feedback about where they're having uncomfortable points, and then those get addressed. So finding ways creatively to maybe encourage people through these events to be a little bit more vocal, so that feedback comes back around to the funding and our ability to continue doing these things. And I saw a couple people came off mute, so there's more to say about this point. Go ahead.
I also wanted to kind of chime in here for what didn't work for me personally, and that was not really putting an emphasis on outreach. That has definitely bitten me before in the past. When I say outreach, it can be a lot of different things. That could be door hangers, door knockers, going door to door, letting folks in the neighborhood know that this event is happening in the first place. I think one of the most disheartening things I've ever heard is, "Oh, wow, I didn't know this event happened. I wish I could have came." And that always breaks my heart. Outreach in terms of connecting with orgs that should have been in participation and didn't end up coming out. Outreach when you have community meetings and folks don't know about it and don't show up. So definitely making sure that you're connecting with as many people as possible before the actual event, and for all the things that go into actually putting on the event, from my experience.
I would say that the not failures, but some of the lower attended events that I've seen are when the espoused goals and values of the program or of the event don't align with the route design. And by that, I mean, if you're trying to really encourage physical activity, and that's the focus of the program, is wellness and physical movement, or that's walking, wheeling, rolling, however, you want bodies moving in the street. If the route is just linear out and back, and it's 3/4 of a mile or a mile and a half, people will do that maybe once, and then they're going to get bored going back and forth unless there's really, really robust programming. So I think thinking about what is the purpose of the event and aligning the route design as much as you can to be interesting to people. Sometimes that means doing a loop, or sometimes it means, a leg and then a loop. It means connecting to a park and then a commercial quarter and then a neighborhood, like making it long enough or interesting or varied enough between the programming and the route design to be gripping to people, where you could spend your whole morning, at the open street, rather than just doing a quick lap and then being done and moving on to the next activity. So that's really important to think through when you're designing your initial approaches.
Thank you so much. All right, I'm going to try to squeeze in one last question, brief response to this. Anonymous joins us and says, I came in late. I'm sorry if you already covered. Do folks work in collaboration with Safe Routes to Schools through the County Office of Ed? And I guess this can open up to Safe Routes to Schools or other programs. I think it was touched on, and there's something in the chat that links to other funding programs. But specifically, I think to Safe Routes to School, is there a nice dovetail with ATP, non-infrastructure, and open streets? I'm seeing slight head nods, so
I
generally,
can't, I can't
yes.
speak to this in California, but I think, open streets, as we oftentimes call them, school streets, where you might in the morning and afternoon runs close some streets around the schools or a block next to a school. That's been a growing movement internationally, and I don't know in California how that gets tied directly to ATP funds, but there's certainly many communities and cities that are doing that, and sometimes using the moniker open streets to talk about those safe routes to school.
Yeah, it sounds like, yeah, very similar sorts of goals for activating people, creating comfortable environments, but maybe not necessarily using that funding source for the same program. They do have
We see it with
different
block.
sorts of modes. Sorry?
Oh, sorry. We see it with block parties. So they use that vehicle in Santa Monica because it's much less expensive. And they often will do it as part of encouragement events. They call here, they're the walk it, bike it, bus it events. And so the schools, usually middle and elementary schools, will compete against each other. And they'll do this as organized through PTA. They're not using funding though, at least here, so I guess that's, an opportunity for them to do that. But so far they haven't made it so formalized with resources like that.
Wonderful. Well, I didn't get to about 30 of my questions, so we are up to time for, and I want to thank everyone from our panel to the people who joined us today, to the folks behind the scenes. I think this was very inspiring and informative. So once again, thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.